Cuba has the largest number of physicians per capita in the world. But so did Cuba in 1900, actually. I'm a historian, and I know that in 1900, Cuba had at least more physicians per capita than England, than Germany, than the United States. So this apparently is a very long historical process. It's not limited only to post-revolutionary period. What is distinctive about Cuba today is that it has twice as many physicians as countries with a lot of physicians like Uruguay or Israel. Why? And apparently it has become a state business, and it's not simply for the health of the population, or the Cuban population. And that's what you three will tell us more about. How does it work, etc. So I just wanted to quickly introduce the panel. First is Maria Werlau. She's the executive director and co-founder of the Free Society Project, also known as Cuba Archive, a non-profit think tank that advances human rights through research and information. One of his leading efforts since 2010 has been to document and raise awareness about the export of workers by the Cuban state and dispel myths about Cuba's medical diplomacy and healthcare in the island. She's a former second vice president of Chase Manhattan Bank. Her extensive publications on Cuba cover a wide range of topics, including recent books on Cuba's intervention in Venezuela. Maria has a BA degree in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and a Master in International Affairs from the Universidad de Chile. Anarela O'Mahony is an author, a human rights activist, and one of the leaders of the civic platform No Somos Desertores, We Are Not Deserters, an association of Cuban citizens, most of them healthcare workers, who have been forced into exile and separated from their family by the Cuban government. And last but not least, Vincent Geloso is an assistant professor of economics at King's University College. He holds a PhD in economic history from the London School of Economics and has published dozens of papers and articles on political economy, economic history, and development. His most recent publications include two Cuba-focused studies where he analyzes the alleged effects of the Cuban Revolution on child mortality. In parentheses, something that Cuba actually had very low already more than a century ago, and the relationship between the authoritarian nature of the Cuban regime and the country's often lauded healthcare system. So without further ado, Maria, you were going to introduce the panel, or? Okay, Maria, please.
Well, no, I'm actually going to just speak about the Cuba's international medical programs, and I titled this short presentation, A Trafficking Business Disguised as Humanitarianism. And I plan to speak about 15 minutes if that works out. So Cuba actually calls its medical programs, its international medical programs, collaboration. Yet these are essentially export sales of human resources, educational services, and medical products that advance economic, political, geostrategic, and propagandistic goals. Cuba has at least 85 state enterprises devoting to selling export services, mostly of temporary workers abroad, doctors, teachers, sport trainers, musicians, sailors, construction workers, and others. It likes to highlight the medical brigades. But in recent years, Cuba has reported from 50,000 to 65,000 export workers in 68 countries, sometimes more. Now, for example, more with the medical brigades for COVID. And it alleges that 75% of these health workers are part of the medical brigades. So we're only using statistics provided by Cuba, and I think Vincent we'll talk about that, how unreliable some of these statistics might be. I'm going to ask the other panelists to mute their microphone because we're getting a lot of background noise, and make sure to unmute the microphone when it's their time to speak. If I'm hearing a lot of background noise. Thank you. A language that Cuba uses deliberately and systematically is meant to nature of the so-called medical diplomacy. The exploited workers are referred to as collaborators and internationalists, engaged in solidarity, altruism, humanitarianism. Notwithstanding the commendable health services that many of these people provide, often in very difficult circumstances, to the neediest of patients, the fact is that they are exploited as modern slaves who generate Cuba's largest source of revenue by far. And this is officially the largest source of revenues. In essence, these internationalists are exported as commodities by Cuban state entities or directly by the Ministry of Health for 2 to 3 years in highly unusual and typically secret agreements with governments or corporations. Some of these agreements are triangulated with other governments or international organizations who actually foot the bill. This is the case, for example, in Haiti and other countries in Africa and Central America. The medical brigades typically provide health services for free to the patients, and most of these are underserved populations in host countries that actually do face a scarcity of doctors. In some cases, they don't. They just simply replace local doctors, and oftentimes at a higher cost. But these workers, the Cuban workers, can be sent to remote or dangerous areas without their consent. I mean, they just have to go. And these are areas where sometimes the local doctors are not paid enough to have incentives to work and live. But these brigades are also used to advance political agendas and provide Cuba financial support. In June 2018, Cuba reported having 38,262 health workers in 68 countries, of which 48% or 18,384 were doctors. In November of 2018, however, the Cuban government abruptly terminated its medical mission in Brazil that had at the time 8,471 doctors. This was weeks before the new president, Bolsonaro, was to assume the presidency. He had promised to hire the workers directly and allow them to bring their families. Then subsequent to that, other host governments, namely Bolivia and Ecuador, but all their others in lower numbers, terminated their missions for political reasons. So in March 2020, Cuba reported 28,268 workers in 61 countries, slightly lower than 2 years, or a good like 10,000 workers lower than 2 years earlier. Then came the pandemic, for which Cuba was very well posed to put to good use. Its armies of diplomats, intelligence agents, and collaborators, and it's all over the world, together with its propaganda apparatus, went to work to send emergency brigades and sell Cuba's miracle drug against COVID, the so-called miracle drug, interferon alpha-2b, which is often sent as a package deal with these medical brigades, the emergency brigades. We have a series on Cuba in the times of coronavirus on our Cuba Salud page. The cubaarchive.org website has a page dedicated to health. It's Cuba Salud, CUBASALUD.org. So you can find a lot of information there, as well as a map and tables on the brigades and that we're trying to continue to track. This is generating these brigades, especially at this time, enormous economic resources for the police state of Cuba to face a mounting economic crisis due to diminishing support from Venezuela, the failed economic model that has never allowed Cuba to move beyond being a parasitic economy, and a very challenging political succession within the military regime that is controlled by the Castro family for biological reasons, because the historics, Raul and company are already, very old. And then, of course, the pandemic brought forth the decline in tourism. Increasing economic sanctions during the Trump administration have also contributed to that. But right now, it's very serious. So this is a very important way for Cuba to generate income at this time. Since March 2020, Cuba reports having sent COVID support medical brigades to 39 countries, of which 33 remain in place with around 2,500 workers. Some countries, including Andorra, Italy, Barbados, Togo, Turks and Caicos, and Montserrat, which is a British territory, have received the medical brigades for the first time. But Cuba's official data is often contradictory and unreliable. We're trying to track it. There's a map on our website where you can see the COVID brigades, etc. And the numbers vary, but pretty much align with 3,000 to 2,500 workers for these brigades. This program, the Emergency Brigades, was an idea that dates back to May 1960, when Fidel Castro sent an emergency team to Chile after a powerful earthquake that was led by none other than Dr. Salvador Allende, who later became president of Chile and the government that led to the military coup d'etat as it radicalized, etc. Salvador Allende was one of Cuba's allies from very early on. Fidel Castro realized that he had come up with a very unique and winning formula to make money while exerting Cuba's influence, developing alliances, securing loyalties, promoting economic and political support, including votes in international organizations, opening markets for Cuba's exports, and promoting the idea that Cuba is a medical powerhouse and a humanitarian example to the world. This is essential for this dictatorship that commits systematic human rights violations in a grand scale to keep up its international credibility. So they banked a lot of resources, material, and others, and propaganda on this. Cuba claims that it has sent over 600,000 internationalists to 164 countries since 1960. Of these, supposedly 400,000 have been health workers to 134 countries. And they have supposedly delivered billions of medical services. Cuba specializes in producing statistics, especially of these medical brigades. The results are outlandish when you look at the numbers, but so be it. They're very good at that. The program grew phenomenally after 2003, when Fidel Castro sold the idea to Hugo Chavez, and they began to export Cuban internationalists to Venezuela to the tune of 30,000, if not more. This explains how, by 2005, export services had actually become Cuba's leading source of revenues, and that's official. And in 2010, the Cuban government realized that it couldn't keep up the secret. This used to be a state secret, that it was paid for these services. It then insisted that it was just trying to generate revenues to maintain its public health system, but that, of course, has been proven false by Cuba's own official statistics. In 2018, the last year of official data, while the social and health service exports were reported to have generated $6.4 billion, this is more than twice tourism revenues, only 1.5%, or 97 million, was invested in health and social assistance on the island. But Cuba has, in fact, invested huge resources to place these brigades all over the world and devotes enormous propaganda to, through them, eliciting praise, legitimacy, and generating sympathy for the Cuban dictatorship and its brand of socialism. It found great opportunity in the pandemic to launch a gigantic worldwide campaign to nominate the emergency brigades for the Nobel Peace Prize, and we'll get to that at the end. The emergency brigades have actually been very successful in helping Cuba expand its influence and presence in countries at a time when they are most vulnerable and receptive. Because few countries have a large pool of captive health workers it can order for deployment anywhere in just a few hours. So these emergency brigades have actually proven very effective for Cuba to establish a foothold in new markets. And it has often led to many years of then profitable collaboration. There's many examples of this in Latin America, Africa, etc. According to Cuba's Ministry of Public Health, until the pandemic, more than around 8,000 Cubans had served in 28 emergency brigades in 22 countries after floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and epidemics. Sometimes Cuba has footed the initial bill, but often international organizations such as the World Health Organization and the Pan American Health Organization, or other governments such as Germany, Japan, France, Brazil, etc., foot the bill. Of course, this is very hard to disentangle because the data, official data, is lacking, but a lot of this information comes out in the media of home countries, in statements by, even official Cuban representatives or the government officials. In fact, this is a gigantic trafficking business that allows Cuba to sell its services that are paid by the host government or a third party, whereby Cuba retains up to 95% of these payments. The doctors, nurses, technicians, and other healthcare professionals receive only 5 to 20%. Over the years, we have been tracking that. The share depends on the country, on the agreement. The oil-producing states, such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia, pay more. So these are, missions where the workers make more, but it's always a small percentage, a small fraction of what Cuba is paid. Then Cuba, on top of that, sells its medical products, drugs, and supplies to the host country at substantial markup. Some of these are produced in Cuba, others are, Cuba intermediates them and makes a markup. And by the way, a lot of the medical health professionals have reported that they have to fabricate statistics and use drugs so that they can bill the local government for those services. To prevent the health workers from finding employment independently, the health collaborations agreements require that the contracting governments grant credentials only through the agreement, so that these Cuban internationalists are not allowed to practice independently. As one doctor told me many years ago, one doctor who served in Honduras said, "We Cuban doctors are the best qualified slave labor force in the world." This brand of medical diplomacy, as they call it, is possible only due to the totalitarian nature of the system. It guarantees a pool of captive, low-paid workers lacking any judicial protections and remedies who can be sold as commodities. The Cuban state is the sole employer in the health sector, and of course in most of the economy. So health workers may not practice privately. As they endure great hardships, they are eager to go abroad to improve their lot or to escape and emigrate permanently. I've heard numerous stories from many of them, some who had been raising chickens and pigs in their apartments to complement their savings, some who went abroad just to fix the roof of their housing in Cuba when they come back, or to be able to buy goods abroad that they don't have access to in Cuba. Many in Africa, for example, buy clothes and sell them at a markup when they come back to complement their income. Because there is an incentive, they have a bonus in an account in Cuba that they can access when they return. So it's better than what they earn in Cuba, which $70 a month is the average doctor's salary. And nurses earn between $38 and $46 a month. These are official figures from 2019. My colleague Anarela Grimal, who will speak soon, will provide details of the numerous legal and practical restrictions that make this a captive and exploited labor force, subject to the systematic denial of labor or human rights. Hijacked educational professional credentials, restrictions of movement, forced family separation, forced exile, coercive recruitment practices, outlandish arbitrary restrictions in the host country that no doctors in any of these countries would agree to. Forced political duties. These doctors have no say where they will go, where they will work. Many must endure unsafe and substandard living conditions. Many have died. In Venezuela alone, hundreds have been killed, robbed, raped. In 2010, Hugo Chavez inaugurated a plaque to remember those who had died that at the time were almost 80, officially recognized only in 5 years of serving in Venezuela. So one can imagine what this is about. Aside from North Korea, no other state in modern times that I'm aware of is known to traffic its own citizens systematically in exploitative labor arrangements. This is the state. The use of forced labor has been condemned by the international community as a practice similar to slavery. And slavery is universally accepted as a crime against humanity when committed by public officials, as in the case of Cuba. I believe the scheme violates numerous international law norms and agreements. We have been writing and stating this, trying to raise awareness about this since 2010. Fortunately, in recent years, there is a lot more understanding, and the US government, thanks to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, has done a lot of work to prevent trafficking and to raise awareness of this practice by Cuba. And of course, other trafficking practices by other states. This violates one of the 3 Palermo protocols, the Trafficking in Persons Protocol of 2003, which is a supplement to the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. It violates the ILO's, the International Labor Organization Convention 29 concerning forced or compulsory labor, and Convention 95 on the protection of wages. Both conventions were ratified by Cuba in 53 and 52. It violates, in my opinion, the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. So this is serious business that countries and companies that participate should take very seriously. What are the additional concerns to host countries? First of all, there's questionable training and credentials of the health professionals. This is, they're in a way produced en masse to provide for a profitable business. So a lot of medical associations have noted the gaps in training of some of these health professionals. Also, as I mentioned, these workers are systematically required to tamper statistics, so the results of these programs are questionable. They overbill for medical services and supplies. And they bring about intentional economic distortions to countries that we don't have time to get into, but some of these costs are excessive, are not being invested in the local public health system to train, medical personnel from these countries, etc. And importantly, there is security concerns because Cuba also uses the missions to send trained intelligence agents as part of the staff to collect information and help the host government advance its agendas. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the missions are intended as part of the ALBA, which is the Bolivarian or alternative for the Americas, that undermines democracies by advancing the political, economic, and social integration into 21st century socialism, which is a recent modality of communism. In the case of Venezuela, Cuba's extreme dependence on these service exports is an important incentive to continue propping up the Maduro authoritarian government by all possible means. In the meantime, Cubans, whose lives also matter, are suffering because, there is daily evidence of an underreported and very severe public health crisis in Cuba. The acute underinvestment in the public health system produces, facilities that have even no water, completely deteriorated. These are, of course, the facilities available for most of the population that are decrepit. There's many pictures and videos on the internet coming out about this. Lack of ambulances, lack of basic supplies and equipment, and of course the scarcity of medical personnel, particularly doctors. And even though the official statistics from Cuba are questionable, even the data that Cuba puts out shows that from 2008 to 2018, the number of nurses and nursing assistants had decreased by more than 22,000, and the number of medical technicians by 80,000, while the number of doctors had increased by 20,000, but most were working overseas. Finally, Cuba has mobilized all its agents and collaborators worldwide to support the nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize of its International Medical Brigade, led by Cuba solidarity groups in many countries. This is a perfect example of how Cuba works around the world. It seeks to undo the growing global awareness of the dark aspects of its medical diplomacy that in the last 3 years have become very obvious. Before, it was very hard to get this information out. But this is a way to protect a main source of income and a powerful political tool. In my book on Cuba's intervention on Venezuela, which I published last year, I describe in more detail Cuba's gigantic and well-funded intelligence and propaganda apparatuses, which provide what is a very effective asymmetric capability, which I called soft power on steroids, that allow for this small Caribbean island with a parasitic economy and military regime to bypass human rights and business climate concerns and exert so much interest and influence in the world. Hundreds of labor unions, solidarity organizations, political leaders and parties, and influential individuals all over the globe are being mobilized for this purpose. And they all follow the same script. It's very easy to track if one follows this as we do on a daily basis. Cuba has also developed strong ties with Norway, which I describe in a chapter of my book dedicated to that relationship. So it's very important to inform the world and the members of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee of the true nature of Cuba's business of humanitarianism. Thank you.
Let me say something about Anarela that I forgot to mention, that she has a BA in history, so she's a fellow historian from the Universidad del Oriente in Cuba, and a master's degree in languages from the University of Limerick in Ireland. And she has been a professor of history and languages in both Ireland and Cuba. So, Anarela.
The law that punishes them for 8 years of exile and family separation is yet to be found. It has never been published. The Cuban authority calls them traitors, deserters, but they are in fact the ones that made possible the achievements that the official discourse is so proud of when it comes to international medical brigade. These achievements come at a great human cost for the Cuban people, and thus basically is what I would like to highlight today, the human cost of the medical brigade for the Cuban people. For 3 years, the organization I belong to, No Somos Desertores, which in English is We Are Not Deserters, has campaigned for the elimination of these and other legally binding norms applied to civil workers employed by the state, either in Cuba or abroad. Thus, certainly violate the Cuban Constitution, international laws, while undermining individual liberties, the right to return to the country of birth, and the right to be with their families. Some of these legally binding norms are the Resolution 168 by the Ministry of Foreign Exchange that serves as the code of conduct for Cuban doctors abroad. The law decrees number 302 and 306 aimed at regulating the entry and exit of Cuban nationals. Article 135 of Cuban criminal law, which criminalizes the dereliction of duty, and a provision by the National Organization of Collective Law Offices of Cuba, which declares an embargo on student records and certified degree parchments. For the purpose of exiting Cuba, Law Decree 306 aimed, according to the official discourse, to preserve the country's skilled force. But in fact, it could be applied to absolutely any Cuban citizen, such as executive managers, administrative staff, graduates with an advanced degree, doctors, nurses. These are the ones that obviously suffer the most due to the high level of high number of them that have been sent abroad. Specialized intermediate level technicians. In fact, everyone that the state considers vital to the economic and social and scientific development of Cuba can be prevented from traveling abroad. Paragraph 2 of this decree states that the aforementioned individuals may be authorized on a case-by-case basis to travel abroad for personal matters. However, they should remain in the country for approximately 5 years as of the day of the application. To allow, they say, the official discourse says, relevant training, and I'm quoting this, relevant training but to vital function in question. It goes on to explain this law decree that the absence from the workplace does not constitute an exception from this norm. This means that if the state deems necessary, any Cuban can be prevented from traveling abroad even for personal or family-related reasons, and despite being unemployed. Ironically, though, this decree does not apply to the ones that are sent abroad by the state. That is why so many Cuban doctors and professionals and technicians and professionals in general take part in these international missions under state control, because they cannot do so independently, because they have this law decree who prevent them from doing so. However, let's say that a healthcare staff manages to finally get a permission to leave the country. There is then another provision that prevents them from obtaining their student records. The Minister of Public Health prohibits the issuance and legalization of all type of academic documentation to health professionals and technicians who fulfill an international mission or who have been granted permission to leave the country. In other words, the government reserves the right to declare an embargo on the issuance of degree and certification of student records, since such documents belong to the states under the so-called free education provided by the revolution. Therefore, they cannot prove their qualifications and they're prevented from professional development abroad. And this is not all. If someone happened to be married or being related in any way to anyone that has abandoned international mission abroad, they are also punished. Dr. Luis, for example, who abandoned one of these state contracts in Brazil, and who is punished to 8 years without entering Cuba, without seeing his family, has a wife who is also a doctor and is living in Cuba at the moment. And she has been transferred to a faraway clinic in the middle of nowhere, and even she can barely see her own daughter. And also she has been warned by the relevant authorities to forget about taking part in any international missions ever again. She has been already in 2 of them, since she is no longer reliable because of what her husband did. But for the ones that are currently or have been in international missions, life is not easy either. According to the resolution 168, the one I mentioned before, issued by the Ministry of Foreign Exchange, Cubans are obliged, while fulfilling state contracts abroad, to, and I'm going to quote, return to Cuba at the end of the mission, to inform their bosses of any love relationships with nationals or foreigners, to get authorization to visit any other city rather than the one they're working and living in when abroad. And at the end of quotes. And at the same time, these workers are not allowed to participate in any event, in any social event, without authorization, or to maintain ties with Cuban nationals or foreigners who think contrary to the principles, the so-called principles of the Cuban Revolution, or with those who have abandoned their mission and they're living probably nearby them. They're also denied to invite their relatives to visit, and this includes their children, to visit them in the country where they're fulfilling this mission or this state contract, whatever you would like to call it, in most cases. So they're denied of these rights in most cases, even though they are due to remain for a year at least in that country as part of their contract before they're granted holiday time. It is also noteworthy that in some cases the workers is only informed about the resolution 168 just minutes prior departure. And in this case, if he wants to refuse to depart, he's also considered a deserter, and he might be prevented from future promotions, benefits, or even could put at risk his own current employment, as well as the possibility of not being selected ever again for contracts of this nature. In other cases, they don't know anything. They haven't heard about this resolution whatsoever. Meanwhile, there are a group of them who are sent to danger zones where their safety is not guaranteed. Surisadai Fernandez, Nora Salvias, and Eve Arzuaga, for instance, have been threatened at gunpoint and have been caught up in the midst of armed conflict in Venezuela. They were expected to keep working in the middle of this situation, achieve impossible targets, and keep their mouths shut. Many Cuban female doctors have been violently abused or harassed, while others have died while fulfilling their duties abroad. Only in the last maybe couple of weeks, or maybe 3 weeks, 4 Cuban doctors have died in Venezuela. And there's still no news of the 2 doctors kidnapped in Kenya more than a year ago. There's no mention to them whatsoever in the official press or by the Cuban officials. Never mention the dreadful living conditions that some of them have to endure, and the way this, as Maria was mentioning, the Cuban state retains the biggest percentage of their wages. And in some cases, in most of the cases, their money, their salary is sent to a frozen account in Cuba, and it's only payable to them upon completion of the mission once they return to Cuba. There is no compensation in case of accident, and there's no compensation to their families in case of death. If they die, nothing is given to their families, nothing. No wonder thousands of these professionals abandon this type of missions. Now, for the purpose of entering Cuba, there is another law decree, the 302. This law decree places doctors who have abandoned the so-called international missions abroad in the same category as terrorists, while seeks to legalize the unconstitutional provision of the 8-year ban that prevents them from entering Cuba. The law decree 302 also states that the migratory authority can authorize the entry into the country when humanitarian reasons or stays advised. Now, I want to note something about, I would like to add something about this humanitarian visa or permit. Its purpose is twofold. It serves as a drainage for human rights complaints against the Cuban state, while it softens the recipient's desire for justice in exchange for the possibility to be with their loved ones once a year. We have heard accounts of blackmail in this regard. The Cuban authorities warn the recipients, if you behave, we might give you a visa next year. But not everyone is fortunate enough to be granted this special permit. Dr. Salvador Carrillo begged to the Cuban consul in Guatemala in order for him to be allowed to Cuba to say the final goodbye to his mother, who was agonizing. He couldn't see his mother. And he recalls the consul almost smiling at him, telling him that it is your fault that you cannot see your mother, that it was a consequence of his own action. Dr. Carlos Ramirez has applied for this permit several times, and all of his applications have been rejected, despite having his 2 sisters battling with cancer and his mother suffering from depression as a result. This law decree 302 also warns that if someone that has been declared undesirable goes to Cuba, like Dr. Nayibi did, the immigration authority may hand them over to the competent authorities. When the act is prosecutable according to the Cuban law. And for this, there is another law, which is Article 135 of the Criminal Code, which sanctions up to 8 years these people in jail. They sanction to jail time to anybody that has left an employment contract. So this is
Anarela, yes,
yes.
like one more minute, so Vincent has time to give his presentation.
Oh, okay, sorry. So basically, there are other laws as well, and there are the fact that there are children that are separated from their parent. And in a recent study published by the University of Medical Sciences in Pinar del Rio, says that there is a presence of anger, sadness, and anxiety, and the researchers called this a crisis lived experience in these children. And these are the children of Norelvis Rodriguez, Yamileisi Suarez, Yaima Martin, Lilian Corona, Tai, Nelson, Yaimara, Manorey. There are so many of them. And these are also the children of the doctors and nurses that are, as we speak, working under state control abroad. Now, I wonder how great a collateral damage has to be before the facades of solidarity crumbles, and how much more the blindfolded supporters of the so-called Cuban Revolution are willing to deny just because they refuse to see the human cost of the Cuban medical brigades, which are not only medical. Now, we have complained, we have written to the General Prosecutor's Office, the National Assembly, the official press, and every institution, and no one ever replied to us. I even had the opportunity here in Ireland last year to talk to Bruno Rodriguez Patilla, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Miguel Díaz-Canel, and I was lied to, and I was interrupted. They don't want to listen, but there is, in fact, a human cost that has to be.
I think that's a perfect moment to leave it there, because that raises a question that we can discuss later all together, and then leave some time for Vincent. That element that they haven't even responded to your concerns. Is that okay?
Exactly.
I mean, we can go back to the conversation later, but let's.
No
Yeah,
problem.
okay.
Yeah.
Then Vincent, why don't you give your presentation, and then that way we'll go back later in the conversation, and remind me to raise that point, Anarela.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so I expect everyone now has the misfortune of seeing my screen. And so I'm going to take a slightly different take on Cuba than everybody here, not in the sense of the general judgment that is reserved of the regime, but in the way we have to interpret what it does in the broader field of healthcare. So, and the reason why this matters is because this is a recurring point that happens in public discourse over Cuba. So a lot of people will say, yes, Cuba violates human rights, but look, it has great health outcomes. Is there a way to separate the wheat from the chaff so we can learn lessons here and abroad about importing the best and leaving the bad out, and the bad being the violations of human rights? And I'm going to make a claim to you that it's not possible. You can't separate the wheat from the chaff, largely because the high health outcomes that are vaunted in Cuba are in large part overrated, but they're also the result of coercive methods and tools that are not accessible to Western democracies. I'm going to break this argument. This argument that I want to convince you of is that there is very little to praise in Cuba and very little to try to extract. And I'm going to try to convince you of this by making 5 points. The first one is that Cuba does manipulate its infant mortality data in a way that leads to a manipulation of the life expectancy data, but it doesn't diminish, it doesn't eliminate Cuba's edge over the rest of Latin America. But a large share of that good performance is the accidental byproduct of macroeconomic policies, not health policy. Number 3 is, even if we take the best case scenario possible for Cuba, if we look at methods that economists have developed to evaluate the causal effect of political changes, such as the 1959 revolution, you find that things were going to improve regardless of the regime that was there, because Cuba had historically and exceptionally low rates of infant mortality and high levels of life expectancy, and they were bound to continue improving. So when we try and account for what Cuba would have looked like without Castro, we actually find that it made things worse. The revolution made Cubans sicker than they otherwise would have been. Number 4 is that Castro did make the country poor, and poor in ways that affects measures of health that are very hard to properly account for. And number 5 is that even if everything I've said before is wrong, it's still not praiseworthy if you care about human development. So all of this, by the way, is based on research I have done or research that other people have done. So this is everything I'm going to cite to you in this paper, in this presentation to you. So the first part, data manipulation. And this is really important to understand, that it's impossible to sort the wheat from the chaff. In Cuba, doctors have to meet targets of infant mortality that are set by the ministry in Havana. And the result of that is that if they don't meet those targets, they're punished. And that has a very perverse effect, because it generates an incentive to reclassify deaths. If an infant dies within the first few days, so after birth, which is called an early neonatal birth, physicians in Cuba will reclassify them as late fetal death. Why does that matter? Early neonatal death enter the infant mortality rate, but late fetal death do not. So if they reclassify the way infants die, they are able to meet their targets, but it has nothing to do with health outcomes. And the other part is that patients in Cuba have no right to refuse treatment, and they have no right to privacy. So that gives doctors a very strong set of powers over them. Combined with the incentives, it means that they tend to take course of action, especially towards mothers who are pregnant and who have risky pregnancies. They take very harsh measures, such as sometimes, and this is coerced abortions or pressured abortions that are not what the mother desires. So a violation of her desires, the doctor will push for a course of action which terminates pregnancies that are risky against the wills of the mothers. And if we pile all of these together and we try to adjust the statistics to make them comparable, countries where people have rights to refuse treatments, and also where the manipulation of the late fetal and early neonatal death is accounted for, well, Cuba is still an exceptionally high life expectancy country and low infant mortality country. You see it here in this graph that I've drawn for an article in Health Policy and Planning. You see that rather than being first, Cuba is third or fourth in Latin America after you make accounts for this. So some people would say, haha, proof, Cuba does very well on healthcare. Wrong. A large part of this, so this is to dispel the myth that all of it can be explained by data manipulation. Data manipulation is an issue, but it doesn't explain it all. What has a bigger impact is the fact that in Cuba, Cubans are restricted in their ability to buy cars, because restrictions on cars, there are import restrictions on cars. There is very little domestic manufacturing of vehicles, and that matters to stuff like life expectancy. Why? Because if you have a car, you get the risk, you get the possibility of driving it, but you also get the possibility of dying in a road accident. And while it may seem trivial, it isn't trivial. If you look at countries like Brazil, which has 9 times the rate of car ownership as Cuba, their car accidents for men reduce life expectancy measured at birth by roughly a year. So it's not a result of health policy, it's a result of the fact that the regime is so restrictive on the ability of Cubans to import cars that the result that pops out is that fewer Cubans die on the road. So that you're comparing with the rest of Latin America with places where people have the freedom to acquire a car and so expose themselves to the risk of dying on the road. And you can see it here just kind of as a way to think about it. This is a scatter plot, not the most scientific thing I've ever done, but just showing the relationship between car fatalities on this side and life expectancies. Countries with very large level of car fatalities have lower levels of life expectancy. So here it's nothing to say, oh, congratulations, Cuba, you have a really high level of. Not really. It hasn't anything to do with health policy. It's an accidental product of another bad policy that somehow yields something that leads to longer lives. And now you could say, well, still, it's positive. Not really. Because if you look at the evolution of infant mortality rates in Cuba, and in ways that is comparable with the rest of Latin America, one thing you can do is use a method that economists have developed, which is called synthetic controls. And synthetic control, the goal of it is to imagine using comparable countries that share similar trends and processes, what would the country have looked like without a particular change? So here our question is, if we want to know what is the effect that Castro had on infant mortality, we should try and imagine what Cuba would have looked like without Castro. That synthetic control method I've mentioned allows us to do so. And if you look at the graph on the left of what I've shown you, this one here, what it shows is, and I want you to first look at the dashed line. The dashed line is what Cuba would have looked like in terms of infant mortality. And Cuba already had back then infant mortality rates well below the rest of Latin America, and it had been falling very, very fast. And so if we use the rest of Latin America as a comparison to try and imagine what Cuba could have looked like, not would, but could, in a plausible way, we get this dashed line. And the solid line is what actually happened in Cuba. Notice that by 1975, which is when we are forced by the limitation to the method to end our survey, yes, infant mortality is lower in 1975 than it was in 1959, but it is above what could have been reasonably expected. So that basically means that Castro set Cuba on a course that reduced the speed at which infant mortality was falling. So it was falling at a slower pace than it otherwise would have been. And this translates, just to give you an idea on this graph here, it tells you the difference between this and this. And to give you a number of excess mortality here, we're talking about somewhere between 33,000 to 47,000 excess infant death per year relative to what could have been. This is enormous. We're talking maybe 10 to 20% more than what would have been normally the case. It's an exceptionally big difference. So Castro can't even be given, and the revolution in Cuba can't even be given credit to what we observe before we try and do any form of causal analysis. And that analysis that I've done, and that was with Jamie Pavlik, somebody else has used the same method, but with incomes. And what they find is, and this is the same logic on this graph here, the blue line is what actually happened to Cuba. Any of the dark lines are different counterfactuals to what could have happened if Castro had not taken power in 1959. And what you find is that in each of the cases, Castro, the actual regime underperformed And again, to give you an amplitude, we're talking about, because this is in a log scale, we're talking about 30% less than what could have been expected. So they made Cuba incredibly poor. Why does that matter to health outcome? It's because until now, I focused nearly exclusively on life expectancy and infant mortality. There are other measures of health outcomes that we should care about. Life expectancy at 65, life expectancy once we account for disabilities, maternal mortality. These measures are equally important, but unfortunately, they're not well measured over time. They're relatively recent measures. They don't extend as far back as 1959, so we can't make that exercise with them. But each of these other measures of health outcomes, like maternal mortality, for example, are heavily related to income. So if you make the country poor, you're actually making these health outcomes worse. It's just that they're harder to measure here. So by making Cuba poor, it's likely that on other measures that are harder to see, there's actually probably signs that Cubans have been made worse off than they otherwise would have been. And the last thing is, and I always love these arguments because it's like saying, imagine that everything I've said up to now is wrong. None of it is correct. I'm still right. And the reason why is this is because why people have focused on health so much. There is a concept that's called human development, and it's based on an idea from philosophy known as positive freedom. And the idea is that I may have a legal liberty not to free speech. I may have no prohibition by governments to do something, but because I'm poor, because I'm ill-educated, because I'm sick, there is no point in having that actual freedom because I can't practice it. And people have decided that there was actually a reason to measure this, a broader concept of freedom, which is the ability to exercise agency. If we want to capture that exercise of agency, what measures should we try and look at to kind of get an idea of it? And people like Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel in economics, said, let's use life expectancy because it speaks to health and the fact that if people are healthy, they can make choices that would otherwise be unavailable to them if they are sick, crippled, disabled, riddled with diseases that prevent them to work properly. They are blocked option by their sickness. Now, the idea was that we can use this measurement as a proxy for the philosophical concept behind it. But notice something here. If I put a gun to someone's head and say, don't do something that is detrimental to your health, I will improve the measurement of human development and positive freedom in this case. I'll make it bigger in measurement terms. But in terms of the essence of it, I've actually perverted it. The goal of that measure is to say, look, it's a proxy for people being free. If I force you to be healthy, well, I've actually violated the concept in and of itself. So when we say that Cuba is able to have incredible health outcomes, well, it's largely because it's a regime with strong coercive tools, which is able to deploy extreme coercion against its population. And it could be that an accident of this is greater health outcomes. Human development, that's not praiseworthy. Even if everything I've said is wrong, which only makes it worse, we can't give this as any form of praise to the regime because it violates the very concept that's at hand. So that's it for my presentation. There was a lot of, I think this is like 5 years of research that I've unpacked for you like this in the span of 15 minutes. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was informative. All of it is available on my website, and most of them are available on Google Scholar because they have become open access. So I hope I enlightened you in some way.
Okay, very interesting, all of it. A few questions. Vincent, I mean, it is true that Cuba actually in 1960 had the lowest mortality rate in Latin America and the second highest life expectancy in Latin America after either Argentina or Uruguay. I don't remember now. And that was true in 1900, in 1910. And not only in 1900, not only, or 1910, not only that Latin American countries, but most of Europe. Most of Europe is not France and, and the UK. Now, my point is, it's true that infant mortality dropped slower in Cuba than in most of the rest of Latin America. But isn't it also true that if you're already low, the rate of drop is going to be slower than if you're coming from, I don't know, 70 per 1,000 or whatever, right? If you're very high.
Yes.
That's one question. And then the other question related to what you were saying, control. One of the intriguing things about Cuba, I was doing an article on coronavirus and migration among Venezuelans and the Venezuelan exodus, particularly in Latin America. And I was shocked by the fact that Venezuela, with a country that is crumbling, has a mortality rate or cases in coronavirus that is 1/9 of what it is in Colombia or Brazil or Peru or Chile or much better off countries. I says, wow, that's odd. That doesn't seem to make any sense, you know. And I think maybe what they don't have, since the whole system is crumbling, is actually an accounting system of keeping records. But then Cuba is even better than Venezuela. Cuba, there is almost no coronavirus. The coronavirus cases in Cuba are 1/20th of what they are, I don't know, in Norway, in Sweden, there are among the lowest. Now, the question is this that they're lying about the number of cases? Or two, is it actually true that the number of cases is very low because as they did with AIDS, right? That they have the power to control, you know, prohibit people from going out. What is it both or one or what?
Okay, so two things. So first part regarding the comparison, falling from already high level or falling from already low level. So in the paper that that I did with Jamie Pavlik, we actually compared with Latin America, but also with Europe. So we created two separate tests, and it holds. Actually, the results are stronger when we use Europe. So when I present the results with Latin America, I'm presenting my most conservative result. When we use the result with Europe's, it's actually stronger because in Europe it continued to fall at a very fast pace, and Cuba was more like Europe than it was like Latin America. So when you compare with Europe, you actually get an even bigger increase relative to the counterfactual. So that's the first part of the answer is what I've shown you is actually the worst case scenario. The worst case from my perspective of the argument that I'm making.
Right.
So if I wanted to be less modest, I would have presented the best case. Even my worst case.
How does it compare with socialist communist countries in Europe, for example, from 60 on, Cuba and Romania?
That actually leads me to the way to answer your question about COVID in Cuba. As strange as it may seem, and this is something I keep pointing out in the economy of healthcare, is there are different types of diseases that are fought by different types of policy approaches. There's a lot of diseases of poverty, and these require generally economic and political freedom to be fought. But then there are infectious diseases where coercion is actually very efficient. So if we have an infectious disease, you can actually force people, say, to stay at home. You can put a gun to their head and say, don't move, don't leave. So strong coercive apparatus are well suited to fight certain types of diseases, like COVID or any form of infectious diseases that are not really income related. But the part that's interesting is if you decide to have institutions that are so coercive that they can fight infectious diseases, there are also the type of institution that make you poor. And when you're poor, you can't fight these other diseases. So there's this kind of trade-off. And you can see what had happened once the former socialist country where basically the entire state apparatus collapsed, right? The sources of mortality from, say, poverty diseases began to fall just a bit, but the ones from other sources actually increased rapidly because it was entirely contingent on requiring strong coercive tools to fight this. So the logic that's at play here, and it works well with COVID, is that a strong coercive state is good at fighting certain types of diseases because it's what coercion does best in this case. We don't see as the high human cost that comes in, and the cost in terms of higher prevalences of poverty diseases like cholera or anything that's water-based diseases, all of those that require rich society and the capital that rich societies have to fight. So this trade-off in Cuba, we're seeing it more of diseases of poverty than they do of infectious diseases.
So in other words, they are surprisingly low numbers might be actually right. It's not that they're lying about the numbers.
Probably.
And to everyone,
they're probably lying, by the way. They're probably lying, but they can't lie that much.
Yeah.
Right? And my explanation is that even if they lied to their utmost, it doesn't explain the difference. What explains the difference is the fact that they specialize in coercing people into good health. But if we have any consideration for human rights, that's in no way praiseworthy.
Yeah. And then for everyone else, I was thinking when you mentioned slavery is not because these people go on their own free will, but they go on their own free will as, I don't know, indentured servants. It's a better counterpart, right? Because indentured servants came to the United States. Indentured servants are like slaves that they are slaves for 5 years, and then after 5 years, they get their freedom, they pay for their passages, and they're fine. And this resembles more that. They go on their own free will on their very difficult situation, right? That they cannot make a living in Cuba. But the mechanisms, the one question that I had was, is there more demand by physicians and healthcare workers for these positions to go overseas? Or there is not how does it work? There's more people wanting to go than there is positions for them? Or is the other way around? That not too many people want to go and they have to, I don't know, maybe not force them, but push them. How does it work?
Should I respond?
Anyway.
Can I?
Yeah.
I could add something onto it.
Yeah.
No. What I wanted to say is, first of all, trafficking in persons, the letter of that protocol says that even when the person voluntarily participates in a trafficking scheme, it is still trafficking because of all the other conditions that are, as you say, indentured servitude. But so what happens is there's even corruption for the better missions. And people pay under the table to be assigned to the ones that pay more, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other countries where the conditions are better. Now, I understand that in the case of Venezuela, especially currently, people are kind of being forced and forced to go because the conditions are so bad that they say, if you don't go to Venezuela, then we won't assign you another mission, that kind of thing. So traditionally, some people feel forced because if they don't accept the mission, they won't advance in the public health system, and the state is the only employer. But most people want to go because it's the only way they have to improve their lot and their family's lot, even though in essence, they're making an average of a month in this account held in Cuba only if they return. Essentially, that's their take from these missions. In the case of some specialists, I understand, that are serving in some of the oil-producing countries, they make a lot more. And still, it's not comparable to any.
Yeah.
Anarela, you want to add something about that?
Well, Maria, she's completely right in what she was saying, and those are my points. But also, we have to take into account the secrecy that surrounds this. Maria, would you like to continue?
I don't know what happened.
Yeah, but you're back with us. I mean, I had a question related to what you were saying. What is the differential, let's say, between the highest paying, in the highest paying place that they go, let's say Qatar, I don't know. Is it $200 a month? And then what is the lowest? Haiti? Or anyone has an idea what the lowest, if $200 a month is what they get in Saudi Arabia, what do they get? Venezuela or Haiti or...
I can't hear anything.
Oh, you cannot hear me at all? Anarela, can you hear me?
I can.
Vincent, can you hear me? Vincent. Oh, Vincent cannot.
I hear you perfectly.
Ah, so why is... Anarela, do you have any idea about that, the levels of payments in different countries?
Well, that depends of the work agreements that the Cuban government signs with the other countries. For example, Cuba also has other interests and other healthcare institutions and healthcare centers. For example, in Qatar, they have a well-equipped hospital. So Cuba has, if you will, invested money into that hospital in Qatar. So I really don't know exactly what will explain why in some countries are paid. Remember also that in the case of Venezuela, Venezuela is a political ally. So to maintain that contract is valuable itself, is a value in itself. Not only the money, but also just to maintain that tie, because Cuba can control Venezuela through the medical brigade in many ways.
I was wondering also if besides the actual money, right, another component that doctors and healthcare workers will take into consideration whether they is desirable or not will be safety. Countries with very high levels of homicide rates. Venezuela was on the top 2 or 3 countries in the world, right? Because in all of these deaths of Cuban doctors in Venezuela are because of what? Of crime?
Some of it.
Exactly.
A lot of it. A lot
also,
of them.
They don't know. They don't have the information. In Cuba, you don't have you don't know what you're facing. You don't know where you're going to. You
Yeah.
are not only told by what the official press tells you.
I mean, I imagine that in all of the cases, these countries will use Cuban doctors to send them to where local national doctors don't want to go. That makes sense, right? But now, in some places, they will be sent to places that are poor, but relatively safe. There are some of the poorest countries in the world, like India, crime rates are very low, right? So it's not poverty itself, but insecurity, right? Yeah, Vincent, yeah.
I think it's important to remember from the perspective of the regime, there's always a trade that happens between the Cuban government and the other government that gets to doctors. And generally, so as an economist, I'll say it very crudely, it's about the terms of trade. They don't really, trust me, the return of the doctor is probably not a great factor in the equation of where they decide to send them. It probably has more to do with which the regimes that where they can send them, which price are they offering for it. Because the trade between Cuba and, for example, Venezuela was doctors for oil. And at that time, oil was trading at very high prices. So this was actually a very good deal from the Cuban government's perspective. But beyond that, I'm 90% sure that very little else entered into the consideration of the Cuban government about where to send them. Eventually, they did send doctors in the time of the Angolan Civil War. Why did it send them there? Because they were offered money for it. That's basically it. It's nothing. It has nothing to do with ideology or consideration for the doctors. It has mostly to do with trying to get the biggest the biggest fiscal transfer possible in one way or another. That's it.
No, can I add something to that? I think this is a really interesting subject that merits further discussion. However, just briefly, there are other ways that Cuba measures the value of where the doctors are sent. And a lot of these missions have huge strategic goals. For example, we just read a report on Guatemala. And when we did the analysis, I mean, it was really hard to get the information to see what this is costing. The Cuban mission there, which is very extensive, 441 people, of which around 200 are really doctors. The Guatemalan state is paying more than double what local doctors are paid, and they're paying even cooks and pilots and support staff. And so they're not allocating those resources to offer those resources to Guatemalan doctors that might be willing to serve in the remote areas that the Cubans are covering because they don't have the incentives currently. So the thing is that Cuba has geostrategic goals in Guatemala too. So it's a more complex thing than it would seem. It's not just economics per se that you would measure.
But there also could be an element of, I don't know, public relations, international public relations. I doubt that Haiti is able to pay much for doctors or anything, right? The poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. But if you send 50 doctors during the Haitian earthquake, the element of public relations triumph is immense, right? For the money.
No, but listen, this Haiti is a very good example because the Haiti mission is probably one of the most profitable for Cuba because it's not Haiti that's footing the bill. It's a lot of countries that are paying for the Cuban mission in Haiti.
Okay.
And it does have a huge propaganda effect, but few people know that Norway, Germany, France, Japan, a lot of countries are paying Cuba for that mission.
Hey, they're having the cake and eating it too. Basically, right? A big propaganda campaign, free advertisement, and big money. You know, it's a great business, actually.
Yeah.
You know, you were saying that you don't know of any other cases. North Korea is doing this. China has been doing this. And I don't know if China was doing it at the level of the central government or provincial governments. Because I know, for example, I was in Israel for a while. And there was a lot of factory workers. These are not highly educated, highly trained people. These are factory workers. A lot of Chinese factory workers, and I was told by Israeli scholars that the Israeli factories, I guess, will pay directly the state governments, not the central government. And then the central government will pay the workers. So there are some other cases, but not of these. Not health workers or physicians, but yes. But I mean, it's true. I mean, the other question that I had for all of you, this idea, okay, that they're doing this and the income, right, the revenue that the government is generating, then they can spend it on domestic public health. I don't know if that is the case, but Cuba also spends a lot of money on two other things. One is the incarceration or revenues, right? Cuba at one time had the highest incarceration rate after the United States, which is the world champion in incarcerating its own people, the land of the free. That's quite. But Cuba was there in the second place, third place with China and Russia, right? Usually among the top 4. So that's one. And the other one I haven't kept track. But the military, it has a huge military, or used to. I don't know if it is still big or they have caught on the military.
Wait. We have to be careful here in one thing. So first of all, when it's this tendency to try and separate health from military is not a good thing because in Cuba, they're very much the same. Let's remember one thing. Doctors in Cuba are members of the army and they are expected to report to the central government. They don't do it always to some degree, but they're expected to report to the central government about what people say, do. So think about it this way. They're the front line of supervision. And there's a good reason to buy this, is they're collecting information about local population, so they're monitoring them. So here, the function of the doctors is not the same function of a doctor as we have here in Canada or the United States or France.
Yeah.
What we're having is a doctor as also a form of police officer. So it's not the same thing. They're very different things. And it's important to remember why, and this is why I say that you can't separate the two. The way that some of the improvements that some people sometimes vaunt are materializing is because Cuba's government is using extreme coercion. It's kind of saying, once you've baked the cake, you can't separate the ingredients. The cake, what is baked into the cake is coercion. And it's only by accident that there's some improvements in healthcare or a greater number of doctors than there are in other countries. It's because it's part of maintaining the regime in place. So people who, and this speaks to the question of Javier, people are not understanding the idea that totalitarian regime or authoritarian regimes need to find a way to supervise their population, and they want to look for the cheapest way of doing so. And the cheapest way of doing so in the case of Cuba is mixing healthcare with repression. They're part of the same concept here.
But do we have any idea what the military budget separated from we cannot separate it, the military budget and the
I wouldn't separate it because they're not serving the same purposes as it does say in the United States. Doctors in the US are not about supervising me and reporting me to another agency. They're about providing care. In Cuba, that's not true. That line is blurred. So you have to kind of take them as part of the same package deal.
Now, do they still have the huge army that they used to have, 100,000 members of the military forces, or that has been shrunk?
I'm not sure about that. I'd have to check. I had to check. But one thing's for sure, what is surprising, and I just want to point it out, is the fact that, and this is part of something that I always point out to people, is the rest of Latin America keeps improving and not at that human cost that Cuba has. And they're not great regime. I'm not comparing a liberal democracy with Cuba. I'm comparing half democracies with Cuba. And what they have shown over the last 50 years is that they can grow, they can have economic growth, they can also have improvements in healthcare and health outcomes. They're not great improvements. I wish they were faster, but they're actually getting their cake and eating it too in a certain way here, where Cubans, the cost of the questionable, which is my point, questionable health improvements actually come at the cost of making them poor.
Yeah, actually, Vincent, another thing that I remember when you mentioned it, that in 1960, when they had the lowest infant mortality rate in the hemisphere, in Latin America, they also had the highest number of cars per capita in Latin America, Cuba. I think number 18 or something like that. Among 19 Latin American countries. So that actually adds to your argument, right? That they had it in spite these low mortalities and high life expectancy, in spite of having the largest number of cars per capita.
Yes, and the sad story about Cuba is that the country was exceptional back then. And it's incredible that in some ways it's still exceptional, for example, and still has a low rate of infant mortality. But I always wonder how much more exceptional would it be today had it not been for that repressive regime. And I think the case is to be made, given the work I've done and people like Hugo Jallis and all are showing that Cuba would be an exceptional country today in an incredibly large number of ways had it not been for the repressive regime that's in place, and whose entire goal is to extract rents from the local population.
But one of the great accomplishments actually of the Castro regime was actually selling a mythology of pre-revolutionary Cuba as something so poor and so miserable and so inegalitarian. I always said, countries of immigration cannot be neither that poor nor not egalitarian, nor they're not repressive, because millions of people are not stupid. You know, millions of people do not migrate to countries that are poor, where wages are low, where a few people own everything, and where besides that is repressive. Why in hell would you move? I mean, a few people can be stupid, a million not. You know, and Cuba was receiving over 1 million Spaniards during the period of independence. Haitians, Jamaicans, Arabs, Lebanese, Chinese. So, okay. Well, Vincent,
It was
pleasure to meet you. Maria, a pleasure to see you again. And then
Thank you very much.
Goodbye to everyone.
And thanks to the Oslo Freedom Forum for the opportunity to talk about this great topic, to Human Rights Foundation and our good friends there. Good luck with a great event.
Yep. We keep on watching. Okay, goodbye, good night.
Bye.